Hey Chris, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. You're looking good, my friend.
It's good to see your face.
Yeah, in front of the impressive wall of books, where you are reviewing them, as the
Yeah,
editor of the review of books is apt to do.
yep. I guess it's appropriate.
Perfect, perfect. Well, thank you again for joining me in this monthly experiment of the Twitter missional chat.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like I think I said, it goes by pretty fast, and you
Yeah,
know
man, that's
the
crazy.
well, in the technology, it's sort of like the messages are sort of coming in sporadically, and it's uh, it's kind
And
of
then there's typos that confuse things.
yes. I'm glad I clarified that because I thought, boy,
Yeah,
that's an interesting
yeah.
thing to
I didn't
say.
even realize I had typed it until I had to go back and.
Yes, recover versus reverse. Those are yeah. So that's good. That's good. Well, you know, we were just talking on Twitter, having this hour long conversation about conversation, and the ebook that's just been published by Pathos Press, the Virtue of Dialogue, and I'm excited about this. I mean, I'm excited. I wrote in the blog today just about stories like the story of Inglewood Christian Church are extremely encouraging to me. And I've been, I've had a couple opportunities to go around and where I've shared pieces of this story. I was just at a conference a week or so at Bright Divinity School and doing a workshop there, and I shared a little bit of the Inglewood story with
Wow.
folks there. Yeah, because I mean, I think, when we talk about so many, obviously one of the things I'm excited about is new faith communities being formed. But we have so many existing faith communities that are are desperately trying to find the way forward, like how to be transformed and how to be revitalized. And and so this is just a fascinating story about one path and one way. And it's not really like one magic, it's not like a magic bullet. It's like this is going to be a key element to any kind of transformation,
Absolutely.
right? I mean,
And it's gonna look different in different places. Um, I mean, I just like I said, kind of at the end of our Twitter chat, that it's just hard for me to imagine that any move toward a deeper shared life together is going to happen without some type, some form of conversation. That's just
right.
kind of when we just kind of have to. It's it's assumptions that we have and uh, histories and whatever. It's all those things. I mean, we don't realize all those things that keep us apart and divide us until we start talking together um, and sharing ourselves in that way, selves in that way.
Yeah. So when I am thinking about an existing church that's stuck, or it's declining, or it's been in decline for some time, and it's they're trying to figure out the next faithful step,
Mm.
they've got to start by talking to each other, and that's the beginning of that story of Inglewood, which has a wonderful history that goes back to the 1890s,
Yeah, 1895. Yep.
and had gone through all kinds of changes and transitions over the years, and then found itself in a place where um, you tell in the book, and you shared on the Twitter chat tonight, you know, uh, one Sunday night, just sitting around, going, you know what, this doing the church service sort of business as usual thing, it really isn't working. So let's turn the chairs into a circle and let's talk to each other.
Yep.
And then you discover we don't know how to talk to each other.
Right.
And I love how you sort of apply that and extrapolate that to a lot, that this is the case in our political climate, and It's really applicable in a lot of different spheres and a lot of different conversations. But um,
But yeah, I mean, I think kind of going back to just kind of the hypothetical situation that you described, kind of a church that maybe is an older mainline, oftentimes urban
mhm,
type congregation. We see it a lot here in the inner city of Indianapolis. But just, I think what conversation affords is the opportunity to say, hey, I mean, regardless of what people looking from the outside might seem to think, that I mean, whoever is there and however few they are, I mean, God has given us gifts in those people, and try to in conversation is a way of coming to realize and appreciate those gifts and figure out how to put them into service um, in uh, in pursuit of the transformation that God is bringing in our places.
right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, it's kind of a sign of hope, I guess, in that way. Um, that uh, that I mean, we're not. I mean, even though our size may be few and our age increasing in a lot of contexts, as it was here at Englewood in 15, 20 years ago. Um, that I mean, God is still here. God hasn't left us
Right.
in the dark, and that I mean, He's gifted us in ways that fit who we are as a church.
Well, and another piece of the Inglewood story that I think is interesting and relates to this, and I think is challenging, again, to this hypothetical situation, which really, I think applies in a lot of different situations, is a lot of the people in Inglewood had sort of moved out of the neighborhood, and through this process of conversation and dialogue and really getting to know each other better, not agreeing about everything, but at least understanding each other. And that's so important, not agreeing. That the purpose of this dialogue isn't to all, okay, we all believe exactly the same thing, but to just be able to understand each other better. And then it resulted in people moving back into the neighborhood. And I loved getting a chance to visit there and see. I mean, there are lots of kids running around and young families, and it was a blast.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's. I mean, I think that's kind of our vision of what. I mean, there's lots of other people. Andy Crouch, for instance. I mean, when he started the "This Is Our City" project, Christianity Today, he had a big piece on the idea of flourishing of neighborhoods, and I mean, I think that for us has been a pretty important part of our life together for a long time. That I mean, God has created us to share life together, to enjoy each other. Um, I mean, that's. I mean, obviously, in conversation, as I kind of write in the ebook, there's some pretty difficult times and, uh, that we have to work through. But ultimately, what we're being called into is a flourishing, a joy, um, not necessarily always a happiness, but but a joy uh, of sharing. I mean, I believe at least, and I think a number of other people have said this before, that I mean, the nature of God as Trinity is communal, and
Right.
humanity created in the image of God is created to share life together. And particularly in Western culture, uh, we've built up all kinds of impediments to to that sort of sharing life together, with many centuries of individualism and consumerism and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I think we're called to flourish and called to, and that's part of what we're doing with the Slow Church Project. I mean, just because kind of the slow food movement kind of encourages people to slow down and enjoy their food. Similarly, we're calling churches just to slow down and to learn to talk together and to be together and to enjoy each other. I mean, I think that's part of the recovery I write in the ebook, that really, and I mean, you kind of already hinted at it, that I mean, we didn't and still don't agree on everything, but what we're building is trust, and in that trust, you can learn to enjoy, to be together, even with people that aren't necessarily like you or don't believe similar things.
Right. And like you said on the Twitter chat, having at least some shared convictions
Right.
about how well describe what are some of those shared convictions, or what does
I
that
mean,
look like?
I think most Christians, and again, I mean, I'm sure somebody would probably try to argue with me on this, but I mean, just the fact that I mean, there is a God, and that God created this universe and created humanity, uh, and uh, and that God hasn't left humanity alone. I mean, I think those are some of the really broad convictions that are a good place to start.
Right.
I mean, regardless of some of the kind of other sorts of assumptions that are built on top of those. I mean, I think basically, again, that I mean, not only that God wants to interact with humanity, but that God cares about humanity. And I mean, again, there's lots of different ways that that gets interpreted from that point onward.
Sure.
Uh,
Sure.
but the fact that I mean, God has created humanity and God loves humanity, and I mean that's a place to start.
Right.
Uh, uh,
And I mean, would you agree that there's sort of a shared conviction that God's at work here in this neighborhood, in this space, in this place, and I mean that gets at the missional sort
oh,
of
yeah,
thing, right? Of then how do we join God in what God is already doing here?
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that was certainly one of the shared convictions that we were working for. We maybe had to fight to get to that point a little bit, um, because I mean, I think there were here. I mean, I think now after 15 years of conversation, I think we can pretty much uh, have mostly agreement on that. But I mean, because I mean, you get a lot. I mean, some people that are coming from pretty conservative backgrounds are so disembodied in their theology that I mean, salvation is the main thing, and salvation is about eternity after we die.
Right.
Um, so I mean, even in some cases, I mean, you don't always necessarily get the God is at work in this neighborhood. So I mean, that was something that we kind of had to fight over and fight for, because I mean that's I think that's pretty important to how
Gotcha.
we read scripture.
Yeah, that's interesting because I mean a lot of the folks that I'm interacting with now and working with now are kind of coming at it from, my background is more that conservative
Sure,
evangelical, but I'm working with mainline Protestants who are sort of coming from the more liberal social gospel, social justice end of the spectrum, and it's sort of like the missional thing is, well, yeah, I mean, duh, that's what we've always done is this social
sure.
justice stuff,
Or
and
no,
um,
it depends where you're coming from.
right, so there's a different kind of disconnect in a way coming from that other end, and but I totally get that. So in you mentioned Slow Church and the
Right.
blog, and you're working on the book with John Pattinson, right?
Yep. Yep.
And
Folks can find that on slowchurch.com. Is the short link to it.
there you go. And so it's when I think of slow food, you mentioned the really kind of slowing down to appreciate and enjoy. And I think of slow food as being more the organic, getting the good, healthy uh, foods, not the processed,
Sure.
unhealthy stuff. And that's a part of it too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that basically, kind of the structure of the Slow Church book, the kind of the three main parts of the book are kind of will parallel the language in the slow food movement philosophy of good, clean, and fair. Um, and we've kind of reinterpreted each of those virtues as ethics, ecology, and economics, um, as kind of some of the central pillars of the slow church. But yeah, I mean, I think that uh, that we see, and again, isn't an original interpretation, uh, but what we see Jesus preaching in the early church kind of building their lives around was not so much the idea of eternal life in a quantitative term, but an abundant life. Um, that I mean, yes, it would be eternal in the quantitative sense, but it was also about a quality of life, and that was kind of what I was getting at when I was talking about kind of the the vibrancy of our life together and the flourishing that we think God has called us into. I mean, that's what we've been created for. I mean, it's to share in that life together, and it's definitely a qualitative thing, and that's what we lose a lot of times when we start to focus on uh, Christian techniques. And again, I mean, that's kind of uh, what the slow food is critiquing a lot of these agricultural techniques, the monoculture, large farm where you grow just corn or just soybeans or whatever. But when we kind of set up techniques to do church growth, or I mean, just saving people's souls. I mean, we're setting our focus so narrowly that I mean we lose this sight of the quality of life that we've been called into.
Yeah, I saw a headline today on one of these church leadership websites. You know, sort of like I can't remember. It was like 25 church growth methods that are tried and true and going to work everywhere all the time. And I you
Right.
know
I
I
think that's one of the things I've been writing about. I actually had a chance to take a retreat last week and do some writing on the slow church book, and one of the things I was wrestling with was this idea of technologies. Borrowing from Jacques Ellul has done a lot of work with on what the nature of technology is. But I mean, technologies allow us to focus on a particular problem, and maybe we can solve that problem really quickly and allow us to address that, find some ways to speed up and to get to a good solution to that problem. But the challenge is that, and this is kind of the ecology, what we talked about in the ecology part of the book, that in trying to solve that problem, we oftentimes take on a lot of extra and unrealized costs, kind of outside the scope of that problem, because again, the scope is so narrow. We're focusing on raising the number of people in our church, or uh, saving souls for eternity, or whatever. I mean, that's such a narrow scope that um, that we take on. I mean, uh, when we think of the uh, the mission of God in terms of the reconciliation of all things. I mean, that's pretty holistic. There's not anything outside of that. And I mean, what we're kind of arguing for is that, I mean, part of the slowness is just kind of bearing in mind that God is reconciling all things. And not that we shouldn't have programs or try to deal with certain problems, but just to think a little bit more holistically as we do those things and think about what sorts of costs we might incur by uh, focusing too heavily on a um, particular problem or particular technique.
mm, right. That's good. Now you've got me wondering, since you're one of the most well-read people that I know, and you quote the Big Sort, and we you mentioned that on Twitter
Sure.
chat, and Jacques Ellul, Wendell Berry's a name that I see coming up quite often. What else are you reading right now, or who are some of the other thinkers that have really influenced you and kind of this?
Um, I would say probably. I mean, again, kind of obviously the slow churches thing has been on my mind a lot, and like you said, you already mentioned Wendell Berry. I mean, as far as kind of where this hits the ground and the nature of communities and the nature of slowness, I think Wendell Berry is really kind of one of the loudest voices in that regard. Theologically, I think that probably the two people that I've been reading a lot. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is Gerhard Lopink's book, "Does God Need the Church?"
Mm,
Um, uh, Actually, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read one little thing. Uh,
yeah, go for it.
uh, but this is actually one of the first places that kind of the idea of slow church kind of came to me. Uh, I mean, this was a number of years ago, but Lothink writes, God desires the salvation of the whole world, but how can that salvation be accomplished? A great many have already tried to change the world. Every revolution sought to free the masses, change circumstances, save people from their misery. Every revolution desires a new consciousness, a new society, a new economy, a new art, a new humanity. However, and this is the key here, Lothink says, all revolutionaries have one basic problem. They are short of time. Individual lifetimes are limited. The masses are inert. If they want to see the new society of their dreams within their own lifetime, revolutionaries have to change the old society in a relatively short time, and they can only do that by violent means. And then he goes on basically to say that God desires to see, agrees with the revolutionaries in desiring to see society transformed, but God doesn't have a shortage of time. Um, um, and basically, again, part of the language we're using of slow church is really a kind of a tip of the hat to Lothink as well. Instead of using like a term like slow Christianity or slow faith, that part of the slowness is that God has called us into a people to share life together. And yeah, that's going to be messy and that's going to be slow, but that's what we've been created for. So Lothink, and then probably the other big kind of theologian that a lot of the stuff that I've been working on recently, at least particularly the conversation stuff, is based on John Howard Yoder's book. I have a little thing in the back of the Virtue of Dialogue ebook. Well, it's a list of resources, but kind of at the top of the list of resources, kind of in bold. If you're going to read one little book on this topic, and you want to read further, I recommend John Howard Yoder's little book, Body Politics, which has the subtitle, I believe, of 5 Practices of the Christian Community Before the Watching World. And it's a look at the 5 practices, and they're things that pretty much every church does, or a lot of churches have done. I guess there's probably some exceptions, but like baptism, Eucharist, those are kind of the more familiar ones, and then some other ones, the Rule of Paul, which is based on 1 Corinthians 14, which is basically just open conversation. So that's really obviously important to what we're doing here at Englewood. And then gifts, the gifts of the Spirit, which he interprets broadly. And that was kind of came up in the Twitter chat as well,
Mm-hmm.
that everyone that God brings to us is a gift, and they have something to share and to contribute, despite how they might appear to society.
Mm.
I think particularly here at Englewood, we've been struck by the gifts of some of our older people in the congregation. We have a bunch of older guys here that are retired and pretty much come to the church every day and just do what needs to be done, whether it's fixing toilets or taking somebody to the doctor. And it's pretty amazing. And here are these people that society would typically kind of push to the margins, but they're a real important part of what's going on here. And I'm drawing a blank, but there's a 5th one of Yoder's practices.
There you go. You got to buy the book. You got to go read it now to get the 5th one.
Exactly. But what he does is say, hey, these are things that churches have done, and they're pretty familiar religious practices. And then he kind of explodes them and says, hey, these are really the roots. These are some fundamental practices that shape all sorts of human relations, all sorts of politics. In Eucharist, just the reality of being together around a table and sharing together. It's an economic reality. Everybody's got to eat, and in learning to eat together. And he takes a pretty literal view of the Eucharist as a meal, which is something that we've lost in a lot of churches. Again, one of the big points of the church book will be to kind of recover that space. Maybe not necessarily that we have to do away with the symbolic interpretations, but creating spaces where we can, maybe in addition to the symbolic Eucharist, where we can eat together and be together around a table. But that's just one example, and he kind of does that with each of these. I actually had to read the book several times before it kind of dawned on me what he was doing, because I was so enthralled with just kind of the history that he told and kind of how these practices were developed, that took several readings just to see kind of how kind of the genius of it and how he explodes this kind of into kind of a politics that kind of extends beyond the church.
Hmm. Cool. Well, man, there's so much more. I've been enjoying our conversations, Chris, and I think for the sake of the video viewing
Sure,
attention span,
sure.
we'll bring this one to a close here. But I
Well,
look
hopefully
forward
our
to,
conversations will continue. I really
yeah,
enjoyed uh, getting to know you and getting
likewise.
to hear what you've been involved in over the last year or so. We've been meeting together from time to time, and uh, I feel really fortunate that you've uh, gotten connected with the disciples, and uh, we'll visit Indianapolis here on a semi-regular basis.
That's
So
right.
those
That's right.
conversations will continue.
Awesome. I look forward to it, Chris. Thanks again for joining me on the Twitter and here on Skype.
Cool. Well, thanks for inviting me and making it happen.
You bet.